you like your home back? Are your children of age and still not leaving home? Well, stay tuned because this whole new series we're starting on the Dr. Dev and Mama Sue podcast is called How to Help Your Adult Children Leave Home. This is just part one. If this is one of your problems, please come back for the subsequent parts. We have this first part focusing all on, are they prepared to leave home? A lot of my friends have complained to me over the years since our kids started leaving home about their kids not leaving. And the number one thing I ask is, are they prepared to leave home? Because I think there's a few skills that they need before they launch. Otherwise, they're just going to end up back on your couch anyway. There's no point. You'll have redone their room into an office, and then you're going to have to put it all back if you don't make sure they have a few important skills. And number one, in my opinion, is getting along with other people. So, does your child know how to get along with other people?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you said the word launch in there, because in the literature, this phenomena where adult children are not leaving home, it's called failure to launch. And it's been kind of steadily increasing over the years. And also, there was an uptick during COVID because a lot of kids moved back home, but still the numbers were going up. And then also, I think before when we've discussed this, you've talked about like it's maybe you've noticed the trend for about 15 years. And about 15 years ago, there was this movie with Matthew McConaughey called Failure to Launch. And it was about a 35-year-old who was having a hard time leaving home. And some of the literature says that it's really interesting that you talk about like getting along with people as being the first question, because some of the literature speaks to this idea of this failure to launch problem starting much earlier, when the person is an adult, but when they're about 12 to 18 years old. If you notice like sort of a withdrawal from social activities, that might be a signal that later on they may be a kid who's going to be a failure to launch young adult. A withdraw, maybe like sinking more into video games, into like sort of more solitary activities, sort of a pulling away of social activities. It means that they're not sort of gaining those skills that they need and sort of that balance that they need from others to figure out like, who am I? What are my values? What am I going to do, as I get older?
That's interesting. I was just remembering my oldest son during that period, actually around 15, started withdrawing from social stuff, and he had always been super social up until that point, so we were really surprised. Like, suddenly he didn't want to go do the usual social things. He really didn't want to talk to most people. Because our house was super social, he didn't really have much of a choice because kids would just end up there talking to him, right? But he really took a big step back. However, he did leave the earliest. He left the day after his 18th birthday.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that didn't seem to go together for him, but definitely there was that withdrawal, and I definitely had some concern about that. Thankfully, I knew he already knew how to get along with most people, but, it was concerning. Any concerns I think that come up in that period, parents should be actively addressing, because any kind of problems that aren't well navigated, 12 to 18, you're going to end up having to deal with it when they're adults.
True. Yeah, and also there are just things that come up during that time, right? And so, yeah, you need to be aware of it. Come during that time, like 12 to 18, as you say, And maybe with your son, it was maybe sort of that natural withdrawing sometimes, right? They naturally kind of withdraw from their family a little bit. And that is actually, but they're actually gravitating more towards some friends or maybe some friend group. And that's actually a healthy thing. They are learning to sort of figure out, who am I? What are my values by, interacting with others. So, and how to differentiate from the family unit. So yeah, it's just something to be aware of. But I think what the literature was talking about is a sort of like prolonged thing. And not only are they withdrawing from you, they're withdrawing from like any friend group too, right? And just kind of like maybe all of their friends are online, which we talk about. Some of the kids did better during COVID because they were gamers, but still there's this thing of like not having friends in the real world, that sometimes makes it hard for them for you to know that they can get along with people, which is essential for them that have these skills to be able to leave home, because you have to get along with so many people on your jobs. You have to negotiate with your landlord about your apartment. You have to negotiate, paying your bills. There's so many things that you need.
Roommates. You have to learn how to get along with your roommates, because most people aren't going to launch into their own apartment. They're going to live with other people, and they need to learn how to get along with them. It can be a nightmare.
Yeah. So that's a good first question to consider.
Oh, the second question I like to ask parents is, do they know how to manage money? Super important. Like, before my kids left home, they not only had bank accounts, but they had, managed them by themselves for years. They had credit cards. Yes, I did have to co-sign for those credit cards, right? But they were in their names, and they knew how to responsibly use them. They had good credit scores so that they could go out and get an apartment, no problem. They knew how much stuff cost. Like, they weren't in like babyland where things were just kind of magically landing in front of them, paid for already. They knew how much it
Where
cost.
is this wonderful babyland?
Well, I think a lot of parents create this for their children, not wanting them to suffer or worry about money before they have to. They kind of shelter them from the realities. And to do that now is super dangerous because everything's expensive, and especially in areas like the Bay Area where the housing costs are so prohibitive. If kids don't know how much housing costs, and it's going to be kind of hard for them to leave, right? Because they might go out and look at a perfectly good room and think it's crap because it's $1,200 and it's just a little room, But in this area, that's actually normal, right? To get a little tiny nothing room without even its own bathroom, for $1,200.
Yeah, so. And in your place, they've gotten used to a different standard of living, right?
Yeah. They're used to having all their own stuff and maybe even their own bathroom and, free meals.
Yeah. Yeah, this idea of knowing what things cost and being able to have a bank account and all that, those things, that's like a really key important point to look at. And when I looked at the literature, and it talked about what causes this failure to launch, one of the things were lack of self-management skills, which you'll sort of need. There's one thing to have a bank account and have a credit card, and another thing to know to have the skills to pay it on time, to make sure you're managing like how much money is in that checking account, all those things. So these are the 7 things that they said. They said lack of self-management skills, parent enablement, which was a little bit of what you were talking about there about, some parents, you're wanting your kids not to suffer. So, maybe you're doing a little bit too much of everything for them. So they have a difficult time. And then the bigger ones were these milestones that the kid kind of needed to pass through before that but didn't, like maybe they didn't get enough sort of responsibility in areas, or didn't kind of take enough sort of agency of their life yet. And that goes back to the other literature that I was talking about, where you can see some early warning signs sometimes, right? And then bigger ones that we'll talk about and subsequent issues of this podcast: substance abuse, mental health disorders, learning disorders, motivation issues. Sometimes there are real reasons, right, that the kids aren't able to do these things, and so you need to be aware of that and early warning signs that may be indicating that they need additional help. So if executive functioning skills, for example, are getting in the way of them, maintaining a bank account, maybe you're going to help them a little more than you might the average kid, or maybe you're going to get them outside help for that.
Yeah. And if your kids are dealing with like major challenges, like it's also important to know whether the child has enough income to support themselves out in the real world, wherever you're living. We talked a little bit about this, how, they need to know what it costs to live in your area, but they also need to be earning that plus some, because in the Bay Area, you have to make 3 times your monthly rent. In New York, I know it's 4 times. I don't know what it is where you are, but I imagine it's some multiple of the rent, right? And so that can be really hard if you're working at an entry-level job and you're making, let's say you're lucky and you're making $20 an hour, how much does that cover of your expenses where you live? They need to know.
Yeah, they need to know, and maybe, have some savings in place, and sometimes, jobs are just to sort of, you have spending money, but maybe think about what their jobs are for, and what they're going to be using their funds for. Just make sure that everything's kind of very clear and transparent as you help them transition. What they're going to need, and help them do the research, or at least not do it for them, but assist them in the ways that they need to be able to find out what's going on.
Yeah, and a lot of my friends have found this controversial, but I told my kids when they turned 16, they had to be working part-time, and that if they went to college, that, they could just keep working part-time through college, and I wouldn't charge them any rent, but if they dropped out, that I'd have to start charging them some kind of rent, after they turned 18. And I think it's good to tell them that long before it's a reality, right? Like, don't just say you have to pay me rent because they pissed you off one day. Let them know this long before it's even an issue. Like, I was having these conversations with them when they were, school age, like, this is the plan. When you're 16, you're going to be working in some capacity. I didn't care if they had their own businesses. They didn't have to work for minimum wage if they didn't want to. My kids did a combination of both, working for others and working for themselves. And I respected that. I just wanted them to have the experience of working. I think it's important, even if you don't need your kids to help out with their expenses, for them to learn what it's like to work in entry-level positions, so that they have more respect for the people who will be serving them,
Yeah. Well, and also just an understanding of how that works. I know from experience, I actually want to go back to one thing that you said, this idea of, like, don't just tell them to pay rent one time when, just because you're pissed off at them. I think in some ways it's a bigger issue, because actually it gives them an inappropriate relationship to rent. Is this like a punishment because I pissed somebody off? No, it should, understand that this is the way that the world works. You're going to have to pay for the places you live. And also this job thing, I can say from my own experience, as a 16-year-old, I was kept from getting a job. So my relationship, it's like I sort of, I would have taken more pride in being able to get one. And I was struggling to try to have a job. And my mom, like, maybe she would have let me have some certain kind of job that she wanted me to have, but she wouldn't just let me, like, I think I've said this on the channel before. I got a job at McDonald's and she told them I didn't want it. And yet my sisters, who I've spoken to recently, one of my sisters about this, they had jobs at 16 and felt like such pride in that. And even my mom would send them on, some errand after work, like, oh, after work, could you go by my favorite, restaurant and bring us dinner or something? They felt a lot of pride in that. And it seemed like it helped them be adults more quickly and also understand that you needed to pay for things and that you needed to have your own money. So I think in some ways, if you don't have your kids get a job, it's to their detriment.
I found it really motivating too. I started having jobs, pretty young, and the entry level jobs I had really motivated me to continue studying and continue getting credentials that would make it easier for me to get higher paid jobs, because I knew I didn't want to be selling shoes when I was 40. Like, I really knew that.
It seemed like it would be clear, right?
A lot of my friends gave me a hard time for charging my youngest son rent while he was living with me. A lot of my friends gave me a hard time, right? Because he's really young for his age. But I thought that he was capable of working for a living in spite of his being really young for his age. So when he stopped going to college, I implemented the rule that he had to start paying rent. And there have been some times when this has been a challenge for him, but most of the time he's been able to pay. And not only does that alleviate some burden for me, he actually takes a lot of pride in paying his rent and other expenses. I think that there is a lot of good that comes from being self-supporting,
Yeah.
Emotionally and socially. I think we feel stronger.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you've mentioned before too. It's sort of if you do charge your child rent, one thing that you can do if you're doing fine, and you're feeling guilty about it, is you can save the money for them and just give it to them as like a gift for when they move out. But I've heard you mention this. If you aren't doing fine financially and having them not pay rent as a burden and they're helping, it helps the relationship, because you become sort of just roommates at that point. And then it's really great. It's like a roommate with, you were saying with Sam, roommate with benefits, actually, because it's like they're still your kids. So you can say like, hey, could you help me lift this heavy grocery bag?
Please come back for the second part, which is coming next week, about are they ready to leave home, where we talk about the signs that they might be getting ready to leave. And share this with your friends who have kids who are struggling to launch.
Yeah, and if any of you have young adults who are having difficulty launching, leave us a message in the comments.
Mm-hmm. All right. Have a good one.
Take care, Hopeful Tribe.